is a bit of an outline of what I'll be covering today. I will start with the background, aims and methods of what we have done before moving on to some components of a tool which we have developed for researchers. And I will then go on to describing our plans moving forward. So starting with the background, voluntary assisted dying, or VAD as it is commonly referred to, is an additional end-of-life option available to individuals who are suffering and dying and meet very specific criteria. It allows those eligible individuals to seek medical assistance to end their lives, and that's done through either self-administration or practitioner administration of bad substances. It provides those people with a right to make informed end-of-life choices that align with their values, but also their preferences. So that includes the timing and circumstances of their death. VAD is legislated in all Australian states, and those laws that govern VAD have been shaped thoroughly through extensive community and stakeholder consultations, as you can imagine. They include stringent measures and safeguards that protect everyone involved in the process, but also, and importantly, they protect those who do not wish to participate in any way. So considering that these laws have been passed fairly recently in Australia, VAD forms a relatively new and growing area for both clinical practice, but also research. So when we look at VAD across the globe, legislation has actually expanded quite significantly over the past 20 years. In fact, over 200 million people can access VAD globally, and it is mainly this international experience, if you like, that is reflected in VAD literature and research. But it's also the pioneering work of Australian professors Ben White and Lindy Wilmot, which give us insights into VAD. So from existing research, we know, broadly speaking, who's accessing VAD and why. For instance, pain is not typically the primary motivation for people requesting VAD. In fact, studies have shown that less than a third of patients access VAD in anticipation of inadequate pain control. Instead, it's loss of autonomy, diminished quality of life, and loss of dignity as the main factors that are frequently associated with requests for VAD. Also, although there are some legislative differences between these jurisdictions, of course, there are many commonalities among substantive requirements for VAD, and the two most prominent include that the request must be voluntary, thoroughly considered, and sustained or repeated over time, and the person must have a serious and incurable condition. In Australia, our safeguards cover these and a few other principles. So every jurisdiction that's legalised VAD has implemented substantive and procedural requirements, and we suspect that these safeguards are likely to play a role in how research is designed and conducted, which is relatively unique to the VAD context. So there are strict criteria in place, such as the individual being an adult with a terminal illness and having a life expectancy of less than 6 or 12 months, depending on legislation. And there are no timeframes around life expectancy in case of the ACT, for example. The VAD process involves multiple assessments by different healthcare practitioners, and that's to ensure that the person meets eligibility criteria and is making an informed and voluntary decision. Importantly, the individual must have decision-making capacity related to VAD, and they must be able to give informed consent throughout the entire process, and that again reinforces that voluntary nature of VAD. There are residency requirements, mandatory waiting periods, and healthcare practitioners have the right to conscientiously object and are not compelled to participate in voluntary assisted dying. I won't go into detail about the VAD process itself, but in essence, there are steps in the process that are taken by the person accessing VAD and other steps which are done by authorised practitioners. And these are nuanced and depend on state legislation, but across all states, they include 3 separate requests by the person requesting VAD, who can terminate or halt the process at any time, which again underscores the voluntary nature of the process. Because of this being such a new field in Australia, we do not have concrete evidence for the experience of HREC members dealing with VAD-related study applications. Also, this won't be a surprise to anyone in this audience, we know that HRECs typically assess ethics applications against the national statement. And despite those parameters, we also know that there can be some variability between HRECs when it comes to ethics reviews. And this is something that's already been discussed, I believe, on day one of the conference. We also know that vulnerability of research participants, but also researchers themselves, which Jennifer described beautifully, can be subjective. And that research into sensitive areas like mental health and suicide are often viewed as research that requires more conservative approach, perhaps. And HREC members often regard that type of research as presenting greater participant risk and ethical concerns. We also know that members may hold strong personal views, which could play a role in their assessment of a study that focuses on what could be regarded as a more vulnerable population, such as people accessing VAD or conducting VAD research. So when we consider all of those factors and the novelty of VAD in Australia, we can be somewhat confident in saying that at this stage, there's been relatively limited exposure to VAD-related research by HREC members, particularly in states where legislation was introduced very recently, in places like South Australia, Queensland and New South Wales, where VAD became available only this year, and this week, in fact, for New South Wales. HREC members are likely to be quite unfamiliar with reviewing VAD research, and they might take a more conservative approach because of it being such a sensitive subject. Equally so, researchers who are interested in doing VAD research in Australia would have limited experience in designing VAD research and submitting their studies for ethics review, which might present some challenges. So now on to our aims and methods. What we wanted to achieve in this space, which is new legally and clinically speaking, is really to take the first steps in helping researchers navigate that combination of voluntary assisted dying practice, legislation, and research ethics. We were looking to engage VAD and ethics experts to design something that would help sort of alleviate potential challenges for anyone that might be interested in doing research in VAD. In more practical terms, we wanted to provide researchers with some guidance on what they should probably consider including in their protocols, PICFs, and then obviously the research ethics submissions. And as part of that, and at the core of all of that, we wanted to support robust research practice and really underscore the need for a conscientious approach that engenders and supports valid consents as it applies to both VAD and research ethics. And we hope that by helping create well-formulated studies that clearly described who and what will be involved in that research, that reviewing HRECs would find it easier to assess VAD studies as well. So the first step for us was defining our target audience, and we kept this fairly broad because we wanted the information to be relevant for a large group of people. So that's a spectrum of expertise, meaning anyone from novice researchers to expert researchers. But we also wanted to make this useful for people that are completely unfamiliar with VAD or the concept of VAD, all the way up to those who are intimately involved and provide VAD services. So we took into consideration the key guiding principles for both VAD and research conduct. So that's the legislation, the national statement, code for responsible conduct of research, etc. And then collated existing guidance on research design and ethics, which are used in other research areas, particularly those that may be perceived as being sensitive, but also other research areas which are related to VAD, such as palliative care and oncology, and some that may be perceived as being related, such as suicide research. It's probably important to note that most people accessing VAD in Australia are actually diagnosed with cancer, and most are being seen by specialist palliative care, hence the relatedness between VAD, oncology, and palliative care. So we then looked at safeguards outlined in legislation and their potential influence on research design and practice. So it's looking for which elements of VAD legislation might impact on the 7 elements of the national statement in particular. Once those steps were done, we created a bit of a draft outline, draft document, which encompassed all of those elements. And we then consulted a range of stakeholders on how best to shape the information so that it becomes a practical tool for researchers. So we engaged VAD experts, experts in VAD practice and law. We also engaged consumers, those who were completely naive to VAD but familiar with research, and those who were familiar with research but naive to VAD, and pharmacists that work in VAD and understand the practicalities around how VAD is conducted. But we also worked with authorised practitioners, which are medical practitioners that provide VAD services. In terms of the results of that work and the guide itself, it was actually originally designed as a Queensland-specific document, but as we kept refining it, we expanded the guide to include information that will hopefully be relevant nationally. There were a lot of concepts that were not specific to the Queensland context, and the people reviewing the document thought it would be useful for anyone who might be interested in doing research on VAD in Australia. And the guide consists of 4 distinct components, which I will be going through next. So we've included a list of guiding principles that span across both research and VAD, and this forms the foundation of this work, really. And these are really valuable reference documents which should inform all VAD research. Next is the research fundamentals section, which describes the overall research process. So the basic elements of research design, research administration, the HREC review process. And we've included checklists and prompts throughout the documents, and things like recommendation for novice researchers to engage more with senior researchers, and for researchers wanting to do VAD research or research in general, to engage with their HRECs and governance teams as early as possible in the process. And we hope that this section will be useful for people who are not familiar with the research journey as such, and that it will help them navigate sort of the research design and ethics application process in particular, which is not unique to VAD. Next is, so similarly, and as the name suggests, VAD fundamentals. That section centres around the VAD process, talks about the legislation, the safeguards, with particular focus on eligibility and coercion. And it provides an international perspective of VAD practices and legislation as well. It also describes terminology that's used around the world. And that may help for people who are looking to do some literature searches on this topic, for example. And then we hope that this section will be useful for people who are not familiar with the basic concepts of VAD, but may be familiar with research. So VAD legislative requirements and research ethics, particularly elements from the national statement, are integrated into this final section, which describes how one might go about articulating integrity and merit in their research proposal, which centres around VAD, describes the expertise and experience of researchers involved to really instill the confidence in the whole research design and the ethics review in the researchers' ability to communicate tactfully and to identify and address distress, for example. It also describes potential risks to participants and researchers and some strategies on how to mitigate those risks. And these are then broken down into recruitment, gaining consent, vulnerability and distress of participants, but also vulnerability and distress of researchers and risk of coercion. And the last section talks about preserving autonomy and privacy of research participants, but also for authorised practitioners involved in the process, as well as the importance of decision-making, which relates to both the informed consent and process for data collection and storage. So in terms of dissemination, our future directions, our aim is to make this guide publicly available at the beginning of 2024, so that it coincides with the updated national statement. It is currently being reviewed by some leading Australian researchers into VAD, and we hope that this will allow us to further refine the guide. We hope to disseminate it amongst VAD communities of practice and through some other avenues. And we're looking to introduce evaluation mechanisms and form of feedback from users of the guide. There could be some changes in the future, particularly legislative changes and potentially changes to the criminal code, which yet again will impact on VAT processes and potentially how research may be conducted in this space. And we hope to integrate those changes as well. And finally, thank you all for listening, but also thank you to everyone who's contributed to this document. We wouldn't have been able to do it without all of these people. And yeah, that's all from me. Thanks.
Thank you, Enna. And actually, from the talk is remarkably consistent with those given by Jennifer and Leonie regarding guidance and the need to be, I guess, sensitive and take into account effects on researchers and those being researched. Maybe a couple of, and I see that Sonia and Mary Boyd were on your list of consultees, so that's good. That answers that question. I was curious to know whether there were many ethics committees involved in the process. And it's a majority of research done on voluntary assisted dying. Does that take place mainly in Queensland, or is it, or rather in those states where the legislation has passed, or is it throughout Australia?
It is throughout Australia. In fact, there is probably more research done in Victoria than in Queensland, primarily because the legislation, because of the timing of legislation, really. And Victoria was one of the first states to legislate VAD. And so there's a lot more research done in that state, but we can see that there is a huge interest in VAD research. But primarily the data actually stems from places like Canada, US and Europe.
Yeah, no, and as some of the comments are suggesting, people are looking forward to. I must say, I'm very interested in voluntary assisted dying and its application. I'm really looking forward to seeing this guide because, even though it's quite clear from the last couple of days that ethics committees obviously have a lot to take into account when looking at applications, but that's fine. I mean, ultimately, I think we would want to be presented with the right information, but I'm sure your guide will help researchers and ethics committees to get a better handle on things they may wish to consider.
I really hope so.
I don't have any other questions for you. No, it was a really, really very clear and good presentation, and well supported by those online. So, Enna, I think what we might do then is, even though we're 8 minutes late, that's not your fault, we will stop there. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time and a lovely, clear presentation.